Facebook and YouTube.
Hello.
Let's just take a moment to come up over there.
Okay, let me know when.
Okay. What I'm seeing is 2 videos right now. I'm going to go ahead and kill mine. And you got a problem? Just a moment. Got another wrinkle on Facebook. I think I'm just about ready to give up on Facebook.
Beth, do you have your class up?
Sorry, I was just getting a drink. Yeah, do you want me to show my screen?
Is that what you
Yeah,
want?
go ahead. Go ahead and get the initial screen up.
I thought that'd be a good way to start so people can see the subject here. Uh-huh. Uh-oh, we're seeing your whole,
Am I showing the wrong thing?
yeah, you're showing the one where we can see the little boxes on the side.
Oh, I haven't started it yet.
Oh,
Sorry.
oh, oh,
Let me just
okay.
start the presentation. I just want to
Oh.
make sure that's working before I
That's
start the
it.
presentation.
Yep. That's good. Just a moment.
Well.
We're just about there. Okay, fire away, Laurie.
Welcome to our second presentation today, October 10th, by Beth Taylor. Her first class was explaining to us the vocabulary and the way DNA works and the companies that we could test with and other resources we can use. And now she's going to tell us what the next step is. This presentation is entitled, I've tested, now what? And I think this is a question a lot of us have. So thank you so much for being with us, Beth, and the time is yours.
Well, thank you. So like Lori said, we just kind of went through some basics. I find that the next question I get a lot is, okay, so I've done a DNA test. What do I do next? So the first thing I just want to touch on is just that DNA is a record, is the way I like to think of it. Yes, it's not a traditional paper record like a probate or a land record or a census record, but it is still part of the probate process, or not the probate process, sorry, of the research process. So DNA doesn't really solve any research problems by itself. There are very, very few relationships that can be proven exclusively with DNA. I was actually thinking about this one day and I realized that not even a parent-child can be proven with DNA alone, on the off chance that the parent is an identical twin. So kind of think about it, is that DNA by itself, there has to be additional research. So DNA belongs with other research, with other records, what we call the paper trail. So like any other part of the research process, you have to start with a research goal. And I push back anytime somebody says, what do I want to do? What should I do with my DNA? My question is always, what do you want to do with your DNA? What was your purpose in testing? What are you hoping to prove, or what are you hoping to learn using your DNA? So start with a research goal and then strategize how DNA works with that research goal. So in this class, we're actually going to focus more on how to incorporate DNA into larger research projects. So our class overview, we're going to go through some basic things about how to start incorporating DNA. We're going to talk about cousin matches, which in our previous lecture, we talked a little bit about this idea that if two people share DNA, then there must be a common ancestor, and then you have to find the common ancestor. So we'll talk some strategies there. Then we're going to talk a little bit about clustering, which has kind of now become the foundation of a lot of DNA research, is something called clustering, or sometimes I've heard these called as DNA networks or family networks. And then we're going to look at two different approaches to using DNA. One is where you start with the DNA and you try and identify an unknown parent, which the same strategy could be used for grandparent or maybe even great-grandparent, but it's usually used for closer questions. And then we'll look at another approach to using DNA where you start with a research and you use get to a hypothesis level and then solve the case with the DNA. Okay, you ready to get started? Okay, so let's go through a couple things about DNA, some of the basics. First off, DNA is the only record or resource or tool in the genealogist toolbox that requires that you actually talk to other people. And I find that I think a lot of us became genealogists because we don't like living people. We don't want to talk to living people. It's so much easier to deal with dead people. However, DNA does require collaboration. So kind of have to move a little bit outside you may have to move outside your comfort zone. But a couple things that, because we have to collaborate, we need to work together. We need to play in the sandbox. Make sure that you have created and uploaded and made public a family tree and connected your DNA to it. Because if you haven't done that, then you're kind of that person that nobody knows how you're related to anyone else. So in this case, you do need to have a public tree that's accessible so that other people who are your DNA matches can use your information to solve their problems. Because as we get going, you're going to find out that you need to use other people's trees to solve your problems. So let's all play together. So like I said, create or upload a family tree, make it public, and then connect your tree to your DNA results. Some companies make this pretty automatic. I know for a fact that Ancestry is the one website where you have to go in and physically say, and I think actually probably most of them will at least make you say, okay, this DNA belongs to this person in this tree. And then finally, communicate. You'll hear this complaint, a lot of people who are doing genetic genealogy complain about the people who won't respond to messages. So think to yourself right now, I'm going to play in the sandbox. I am going to be out there and be available and helpful to other people who are trying to solve their problems. Okay, the next thing that you want to do is to start keeping track of the people that you match and how you match to them. Think about this. For those of you who've taken a DNA test, how many matches do you have? I know at one point I kind of just did a download of my matches, and this is probably 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and I had thousands and thousands of matches. And it's easy to think, oh, I can keep in my head who all those people are, and you can't. So find a way to keep track of those matches, meaning what's their username, who are they really, how are they related to you, what's their real relationship. So track your matches. There's a lot of the websites now, actually all of them have a notes feature. We'll look at that in a second. Or you might even build a table in Word, or I build spreadsheets in Excel all the time, especially as I'm working on problems to try and sort matches and do all sorts of things. You're going to have to start kind of organizing your matches. I think this is a kind of an issue throughout genealogy, is that it's become so easy to just follow hints and attach sources. We've kind of gotten away from this idea of keeping organized and organizing your research and tracking your research with a log. And it's the same thing with DNA matches. You have to do something to track these matches. So like I said, you could use a Word table, create a spreadsheet in Excel. Like I said, every single one of the DNA companies has a notes feature. So here's Ancestry. You pull up any match, it has a little thing that says add a note. Here's Family Tree DNA, has a little notes feature. There's MyHeritage, and that's 23andMe. So as you start to figure out who these matches are, make sure that you're finding a way to track that information. So that's one example. Use the notes to do that, or you could create a spreadsheet. And what we'll see throughout this class is, instead of me showing one specific DNA company because they all provide match lists. We're just going to use a spreadsheet for all of our cases. We'll do a couple of case studies in this class. So we'll actually be using a spreadsheet. And this is, I've made a very simple one just for the purposes of the class. Okay, a couple other suggestions that you might want to do, especially going back again to what's your research goal, is you may want to test with or upload to another website. I mentioned in the previous class, but Ancestry and 23andMe do not allow you to upload your results from other companies. However, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and GEDmatch, and I don't have living DNA on there, but they all allow you to upload your results from other companies. So it could be that if you go fish in more ponds, is oftentimes the phrase, if you go fish in another DNA pond, you might catch different fish, meaning you'll get different matches that might help you with whatever your research goal is. And also consider taking other DNA tests. The number of times I recommend a Y DNA test, but I'm like, oh, you're working on your actual patrilineal line right now, or this is your mother's, your mother's maiden name. Well, does she have any brothers? Are any of her brothers living? Do they have any sons? If not, can you get a Y DNA test? So think about that. Is there another DNA test that's going to actually help with this issue? Okay, so a couple things, make sure that you're collaborating, make sure that you're playing in the sandbox, fishing in other ponds. Let's get into actually kind of some basics of just working with your DNA results, with your match lists. You'll notice we're just going to talk about match lists in this class. We are focusing here on autosomal matches, but you can do similar things with your Y matches. So a couple terms to kind of keep in mind as we work with cousin matches. First off, a match. When I say who is a match, what do I mean by a match? A match is a tester, so someone else who took a DNA test who shares DNA with you. What this means is that you're a person who is a match to you may not be a match to me. Now they may be a match to me too, but a match is kind of exclusive to you. That makes sense. It requires a reference point. So a match list is just a list of the people who took DNA tests and share DNA with you. A segment, a lot of people will talk about the number of segments. A segment is not a specific length of DNA. It just simply is any length of DNA shared in common by two people. But again, that segment is going to vary. So if you and I were a match and we have a segment that's 16 centimorgans, it doesn't mean that if I'm a match with somebody else that I'll have that same 16 centimorgan match. It might be something different. And so you might even have two siblings that you match with, and with one of them you share, 23 centimorgans, and with another, with their sibling, you might match and share 100 centimorgans, and their segments, it might be a different number of segments. Anyway, segments again it's a reference point. It's a specific uninterrupted length of DNA shared in common by two people. Centimorgan, we mentioned this in the previous class, but again, it's just a unit of measurement. Just again, measuring the length of DNA shared in common by two individuals. You'll also talk a little bit about MRCA, or most recent common ancestor, or ancestral couple. It's just that the most recent ancestor that you and a match share in common, kind of with the assumption that DNA that you share in common, that the DNA that you share came from that line that you share in common. And again, we mentioned this a little bit in the last class, something called a non-paternal event, or not the parent you were expecting is what some people call this, or another term a lot of people are using is called a misattributed parental event. And what this means is just that the father of record does not match the biological father. We're seeing, unfortunately, DNA is revealing this happens a lot more than we ever thought it did. I think that there's a lot of situations, and maybe the father wasn't, anyway, there are just a lot of situations, and this can be caused by sperm donation, or and the great thing about using the misattributed parental event is it could also cover egg donations as well. So lots of things going on. Okay, so to make things a little easier, we're going to actually introduce a fictional person, Katie, and we're going to help Katie figure out some of her cousin matches. So Katie did a DNA test, and she has all of these people who share DNA with her. So we start with Robert, who shares upward at 930 centimorgans, all the way down to Claudia, who shares 57, and probably Katie's list goes way, way beyond this. Again, but she is fictional. All of the examples in this class are fictional. So Katie doesn't know what to do with her matches. She's got this great list of matches, but what's next? So Katie is, the first thing to kind of learn and practice is just this basic skill of determining the common ancestors. So we're using autosomal DNA in this case. Katie's goal is just to pick one of her matches and find the most recent common ancestor. Again, so based on the amount of DNA that she shares with those other testers, the website usually predicts a relationship, or you can use something called the shared centimorgan tool, which we'll look at in a second. And then, based on, okay, the ancestry saying this is a second to fourth cousin, now you go look at their tree and see if you can make that work. Can you find a common ancestor that would, again, validate the second to fourth cousin? So you evaluate their tree. Notice they need to have a tree in order for it to be evaluated, and then you figure out your relationship. So again, looking at Katie's matches, who do we want to start with when trying to find a common ancestor? Well, it's easy to think, okay, I should start with Robert because look, Robert shares 930 centimorgans. That's a lot. However, what is Robert missing? He does not have a tree. And if he doesn't have a tree, then Katie's never going to be able to figure out the common ancestor. So Katie's instead going to start with Jacob because he's the first person on her match list who has a tree. So Katie pulls up Jacob's tree. Jacob's tree looks something like this. Now, if you've done a DNA test and looked at other people's trees, this is actually more common than we would hope. What this means is that Jacob took the test, thought it was fun, started a tree because Ancestry kind of made him do it and never got beyond that point. A lot of the companies, get you started on a tree, but they might not ever come back to it. So Katie comes back and says, okay, Jacob's not going to work because Jacob's tree said private, private, and private. So she moves down to the next person on her tree who has a tree, or the next person on her match list who has a tree. In this case, it's Laura. So let's take a look at Laura's tree. Now, before we do that, the one thing to know is we go back and Laura shares 123 centimorgans, and the company that Katie tested with, whether it's Ancestry or someone else, is predicting that Katie and Laura are about second to fourth cousins. Now, if they're second to fourth cousins, what does that mean? And I think sometimes it's helpful to take a step back and think, okay, second to fourth cousins means where's the common ancestor? Now, if she's a second cousin, they share great-grandparents in common. If she's a third cousin, they share second to great-grandparents in common. And if she's a fourth cousin, they share third great-grandparents in common. So that kind of gives you a sense of where in Laura's tree Katie needs to be looking to find that common ancestor. The other thing that Katie's going to want to pay attention to, if she can, if Laura's got a good tree, is to start looking at birth dates. So kind of think about whether this person is in your generation, or if they're in a generation, are they a generation younger than you, a generation older than you, or can you not tell? So let's say you're born in 1960. Are they born around the 1980s? Are they born around the 1940s? Are they born in the 1950s, which means they're, who knows, it could be your generation or a generation off. But that will also help as you try and consider whether this person is going to be a flat out second cousin, third cousin, or fourth cousin, or whether there might be a removal in there. Now, that can be helpful to kind of guess, but again, what then you'll sometimes find, of course, is that people had children. They might have 12 children, and by the time the youngest child is born, the oldest child is having kids, and then the generation and the ages get off. But it can still be helpful to kind of pay attention to those things as you're looking at them. But so first off, if Katie and Laura are second to fourth cousins, they probably share a common ancestor in the third great grandparent range. That gives us a starting point to look. And we also want to consider whether Katie and Laura are in the same generation or not. And you can do it based on birth years, but again, that's not always predictive, but it's at least something to start with. The other thing that Katie might want to take a look at is what's called the Shared Santa Morgan Project. And I'm showing you, this is the version 3.0. Blaine actually came out. Blaine is the author of this particular chart. He compiles data, he compiles information. But he came out with a new version of this in April of this year. I don't know exactly which month, but he does have a version 4.0 out there as well. This chart itself, though, is based on real data. So whereas Ancestry or 23andMe or Family Tree DNA or MyHeritage is saying, we predict you're a second to fourth cousin, what Blaine Bettinger did, he's one of the top genetic genealogists out there, he said, let me gather real data from real people and get some information. And he put together what he calls the Shared Santa Morgan Project. So every now and then he'll come out and he'll be like, okay, tell me, if you've proven, if you know relationships, so you know that you and this person are related, and you know how much DNA you share in common, and you know what the relationship is, give me that information. And then he compiles it all. I think he used 50,000 samples in the last version. But so it's a great way of kind of seeing ranges. So if you look at, for example, over there on second cousin, and again, this is an earlier version of the chart, but about 200, a second cousin shares on average, based on all the data he compiled, 233 centimorgans with a range of 46 up to 515 centimorgans. So kind of could say, yeah, does that amount of DNA fit into what we'd expect based on the Shared Centimorgan Project? Or is that like, you're thinking this is a second cousin, but they're sharing 851 centimorgans. That might be a clue that something's off, that the relationship might be different than you think. But it's a great tool, a great resource, and it's hosted on DNA Painter if you want an interactive version of it. Anyway, so let's go back to Laura, to Katie. Katie was trying to figure out how she's related to Laura. Katie looks at Laura's family tree. And we won't look at all of Laura's family tree because there's not quite space on the slide. But as she looks out at Laura's family tree, she comes to a couple named Douglas and Catherine. She's like, wait a second, I know Douglas and Catherine, they're my ancestors too. So Katie, just by virtue of looking at Laura's family tree, has identified the common ancestral couple, Douglas and Catherine. So Katie says, okay, so Douglas and Catherine are Laura's second great grandparents. But now she needs to figure out how she and Laura are related, because Douglas and Catherine are also her ancestors. And this is where I like to draw out descendancy charts. I'm a visual person, so I always draw them out. So Katie and Laura share 123 centimorgans. Katie says, well, it's my great-grandparents are Laura's second great-grandparents. Now, it's great if you can figure that out in your head. Like I said, I prefer drawing these out. When I'm actually at the family history library and I'm helping the guests that come in the door, we have these little quarter sheets, and I draw these things out on quarter sheets all over the place, trying to put relationships together. So Katie and Laura, it turns out, are second cousins once removed, because Katie and Laura's father Scott are in the same generation and Laura's one generation removed. Okay, so Katie can come back to her spreadsheet and she's just going to put in their relationship is 2C1R, standing for second cousin once removed, and that the common ancestor are Douglas and Catherine. Okay, there are a couple problems that you'll run into as you start doing cousin matching, as you try and figure out the common ancestor. So one problem is that there's no obvious common ancestor, and this can be caused by a couple of situations. One is that they don't have a very big tree. You'll see a lot of people who just have themselves and maybe their parents, like that private situation, or maybe grandparents. So if they have a small tree, you can extend their tree. Use, Ancestry public member trees, MyHeritage family trees. One of my favorite tools, honestly, is on Family Search Family Tree. If you can find one of the people on their chart that's named on their on the tree that they have, even if it's like their grandfather, and you go find them in Family Search Family Tree, and then you click View My Relationship, and it just did your whole descendancy for you. You didn't even have to figure it out. But people who have full trees, sometimes what it means is that there's evidence of somebody's tree isn't accurate, and there might be an adoption or a non-paternal event going on that you just don't know about. And it could be in your tree, but it could be in their tree. And so you have to gather more evidence to figure that out. So with the small trees, let's take a look at somebody who has a small tree. So the next person in Katie's match list who has a tree is Amanda. So Katie looks at Amanda's tree, and Amanda has one of these great trees. It's Amanda's parents are private and private. Her grandparents are private and private, and her grandparents on the other side are private and Annie. Well, if Amanda gave us one name, sometimes you can use that much to go out and look at other trees. So we've got Annie, and obviously we have more information than just her name, but we're just going to use names right now. So Katie goes out and she looks for Annie in other trees, and she finds Annie in another tree online and finds Annie's parents are Daniel and Sarah. Daniel's parents are Samuel and Helen, and goes back to Samuel's parents, it's John and Florence. And Katie's like, oh, wait a second, there I spotted my common ancestor couple. It's John and Florence, and that's the couple that's how she's related. So at this point now she has to combine Katie's small tree or Amanda's small tree with this tree that she's found online. So there was Amanda's tree, and now she's built out Amanda's tree for her. Now she's used online trees. You can also use records and build your own trees out to do this. But now she knows how Amanda is related to John and Florence. They're Amanda's third great grandparents, and they're also Katie's relatives. So Katie and Amanda share 121 centimorgans. Katie's second great grandparents are Amanda's third great grandparents. So we now know that Katie and Laura, this actually should be Katie and Amanda, I apologize, are third cousins once removed. So she can go back to her spreadsheet and take note of that fact and say that Amanda is a descendant of John and Florence. So there are other situations in which, for example, you might have cousins who have no tree. So honestly, you should try and communicate with your cousins, but again, we run into a lot of issues. They might not respond. They might not be able to share information about their family. Maybe they don't know anything about their family. Maybe they were adopted, or there's a non-paternal event in their line, or they have an unknown parent or something. And that's when we can start using the shared matches feature to create clusters, which is what we'll talk about next, is what are clusters. So shared matches feature, they're called different things based on the websites. Ancestry and MyHeritage call them shared DNA matches or shared matches. 23andMe calls it, I think that's 23, relatives in common, and Family Tree DNA says it's in common with or not in common with, but it's all the same feature. So this is what we call match clusters, or creating clusters. So remember, we have Katie has her matches, and we know that we know how Katie and Laura are related to each other. We can actually use this information to try and identify something about some of the other people on her match list using or creating what are called clusters, is the term I use, is that you want to go cluster things. So with shared matches, what shared matches does is it says, okay, Katie and Laura share DNA. And we know how Katie and Laura are related. They have the common ancestor of Douglas and Catherine. We also know that Katie's related to a bunch of other people: Robert, Andrea, Charles, Jacob, Kyle, Erica, Brandon, Kelly, and Sarah. By using, what happens when you go do the shared matches is you say, okay, Katie and Laura share DNA, and Katie shares DNA with all these people, and Laura shares DNA with Charles and Erica. So if we know how Katie and Laura are related, and we know that both Katie and Laura share DNA with Charles and Erica, we can guess that Charles and Erica are also related to Katie through the same line of Douglas and Catherine. Now, it might be a generation back, that the common ancestor exists, but we do think that they're somehow connected to Douglas and Catherine. So what we're effectively doing is creating a cluster of people who are connected to Douglas and Catherine. So that's the kind of the basics of clustering. And a lot of times we'll start by clustering at just the grandparent level. So we're trying to take your matches and split them out into 4 grandparents. We'll talk about that in a second, how to get started with that. So we noticed that Charles and Erica, who share DNA with both Katie and with Laura, they don't have trees. Now, even though they don't have a tree, we can guess that they are somehow connected into Douglas and Catherine. We don't know exactly how or where that relationship exists, but we're making that guess. And the reason that's helpful is if Katie's goal is to research, the John and Florence's line, not Douglas and Catherine's line, she knows that Charles and Erica it's not worth it right now to reach out and email them and try and figure out how they're connected, because they aren't related to her research goal. However, if her focus is Douglas and Catherine, she now has people that these are the ones she does want to email. So what clustering effectively does is it helps you kind of break up your DNA matches into from thousands and thousands, tens of thousands for a lot of people. It starts letting you kind of group them into networks or clusters, and that way you can just start focusing on the clusters that actually relate to your research goal. And then that way you can set the others aside until you come back to that kind of situation. Now, in exactly the same way that Katie used shared matches to take Laura and find the common the shared matches with Laura, she can also take somebody like Sarah who doesn't have a tree and look at Sarah's shared matches. And if Sarah's shared matches include Amanda, she can guess that Sarah belongs to John and Florence. So you can do it both. You can do it either direction. You can take somebody that you already know and build a cluster around them. And then later on, as you find a few additional new matches, then you can look at their shared matches to figure out which cluster they belong in to. So it kind of works both ways. Like I mentioned, there's kind of been a push to use that you start by clustering to your grandparent level. And you do something, this is called the leads method. It's also, there's some tools that will let you auto cluster, but you can actually start marking people by your 4 grandparents and then eventually break those clusters into great grandparents. So you'd have 8 clusters and so forth. And especially the more other people that have tested and the more relationships that you can prove, the better, the easier it's going to be to cluster. So Katie can start clustering her matches. So we have a group with Charles and Laura and Erica, and it turns out Claudia in it. And then a group or a cluster that has Jacob and Amanda and Sarah and Brandon and Stephanie in it. And then she might have a few smaller clusters. Again, we're looking at such a small number of matches right here, and you'll notice that Robert and Emily might end up in 2 different clusters. What that's probably a sign of is that Robert and Emily are first cousins, or in that first cousin realm, which means that they are in 2 clusters because they belong to 2 grandparents. So something to kind of look into as you cluster. There's a lot of, like I said, this is sometimes called the leads method. After one of the first people that really started using and teaching this process, there are a couple of tools that will do it for you, will auto cluster. Genetic Affairs has an auto cluster feature, though, which unfortunately, due to some other issues, no longer works with Ancestry, but it'll take your results from any other company and cluster them for you. DNA GEDCOM has a clustering feature. MyHeritage, originally Genetic Affairs wouldn't work with MyHeritage, so MyHeritage went to Genetic Affairs and they built a tool that's on MyHeritage that does the Genetic Affairs auto cluster for you. And then GEDmatch was building a clustering tool. I'm not sure where they are in that process. So this idea, again, of breaking your matches into groups is what it's doing. Okay, so those are kind of the basics of using DNA as you try and work on your research problem. I want to talk specifically about 2 kind of situations and walk through the process of actually using DNA to solve a case. And you'll notice that it'll use clustering as part of that. And it'll also, figuring out the common ancestor with cousins, because that's kind of the basics, but then we need to adapt it for your specific case. So let's look at what I call a DNA first approach, which in this case is finding unknown parents. This can also sometimes be used for grandparents, like I said, but I find this is more usable when you're working on more recent generations. Though I think as we get more and more DNA testers out there, more and more people in the databases, I've seen people start to use the same kind of process for questions that are a little bit further back, 3 or 4 generations back. It just requires a lot more clustering to get down to that level. But let's take a look at it. So the basic process that we're going to follow, and we're going to use autosomal DNA for in this case, again. In this case, our goal is to find an unknown parent. And the process that we're going to follow is to start by, because we're only finding one unknown parent, we need to cluster in order to identify people that belong to that unknown parent, the matches that are connected through that unknown parent. So what we have to do first is do some clustering to just focus on those. Then we take those matches and we look at their trees. Again, we hope that they have a family tree, and if they don't have a family tree, that's sometimes when you get to start building out their trees for them. But again, your goal is to find a common ancestor among all their trees. So whereas when you're with a cousin match, your goal is to find the common ancestor between you and the cousin. When you're looking for an unknown parent, you have to take the person out of the mix. So if it's me that's looking for an unknown parent, I have to remove myself from the equation because I don't know anything about that side of the family. Instead, I take a group of people and I'm going to, again, try and find the common ancestor among those group of people. And then I'm going to assume that I am somewhere in the descendancy of that common ancestor. So you identify the descendants of the common ancestor, and then you start looking for connections between dates, places, tie it into, you might find what we call a second cluster with a different set of, with a different common ancestral couple. And then you try and figure out where the two sets of descendants intersect. But you just start kind of exploring that information. So that's kind of the process that you follow for finding unknown parents. So let's actually take a look at this. Let's actually look at a case study. So we're going to use Steve. Like I mentioned earlier, these are all fictional individuals because I don't want to use somebody real because most people are still living. So that's why I kind of just created a version. But this is a process that I followed, and I know other people have followed to find unknown parents. So Steve's goal is to find his biological father. Steve knows that, and like when you do the regular research process, you have to start with what you already know. You gather known information. So what does Steve already know? Well, Steve himself was born in 1971 in Arizona. Kathy, who is Steve's mother, died in 2003. So she's not going to be able to help us identify the father. But throughout her lifetime, she gave Steve 3 different names for his biological father. So Steve doesn't really know who his father was. Steve does know that Kathy was living in California from 1968 to 1970. So we're going to guess that Steve was probably conceived in California because he's born in 1971 in Arizona. You have to start thinking about some of these things as you work on these kind of cases, because you have to say, okay, if they're born at this point, where was mom 9 months before that? That can sometimes get a little complicated to figure it out. And then we also want to consider how old was mom when Steve was born. So Kathy was born in 1947 in Utah. That means she was about 23 years old when Steve was born. So you want to kind of think, okay, because at least in my experience, when I'm looking at a teenage girl, a teenage pregnancy, you're more open to the fact that the biological father could be a teenager at that time. However, if the woman's a little bit older, it's less likely that a 16-year-old fathered a child with a 23-year-old, things like that. So you want to kind of be aware of those kinds of situations. So we do know a little bit more about Kathy, that she was born in 1947, gives us her age when Steve was born. I guess about 23, sorry, about 24, about 23 when he's conceived. Okay, so Steve takes a DNA test, and he gets a nice match list. Now, the first thing that Steve has to do looking at his match list is he has to cluster, meaning he needs to separate his matches out into mom's matches and dad's matches. Now, we don't know dad, but we identify mom's matches in order to take them out of the equation. I sometimes, as I've helped people with this process, they're always like, well, I already know mom. Why am I identifying mom's matches? It's because we need to exclude them. So the first thing that we do with Steve is we start with that very high level match, Janet. And Steve doesn't even have to look at Janet's tree because he's like, oh, that's actually my mother's sister's daughter. She's my first cousin. So what that means is that Janet has, because she comes through a sibling, a full sibling of his mother, it means that all of Janet's shared matches are probably Steve's maternal matches. They come from mom's side of the family. So Steve can do what we Steve can create a cluster by doing shared matches. So Steve pulls up Janet, and then you runs a shared matches feature on whatever website he's working on. And again, he knows that Janet, they come from Donald and Margaret, who are his grandparents on his mother's side. And he determines that Kenneth, Peggy, Dorothy, Nicole, Christina, Daniel, Rebecca, and Elizabeth are all shared matches with Janet. So he doesn't need to look at their trees. He doesn't need to look at anything, but he can say that most likely those people are all maternal matches. And because he's not interested in his mother's side, he can now exclude that entire cluster. So he's pretty much created a maternal cluster and then excluded it. So that kind of makes sense what he's doing. So by kicking it out, whoever's left then are the unknown biological father's matches. So we're going to take them out of the equation. So if you'll notice, sorry, I just pulled them all out of the list so that we could just look at Steve's paternal matches. Now the next step is that Steve knows these are his paternal matches. Now, let's say you're looking for a grandparent's parents, or you're looking for an unknown grandfather. You'll do this, but you need 4 clusters. You need to kick out or exclude all of the other clusters. So that's why clustering can be so helpful, is it's going to help you really narrow in on just the matches that relate to your research goal. So here's Steve's paternal matches. And Steve is now he needs to start looking at their trees. Now, like before, he has to start with the first one that actually has a tree. Henry is not going to help him in this case. Henry, with his nice 217 centimorgans that he shares in common, it's just not going to be helpful in this case because he has no tree. So Steve is going to start with Ronald. Ronald shares 178 centimorgans and he has a tree. And we're crossing our fingers that his tree doesn't just say private, private, and private, right? So Steve pulls up Ronald's tree and, oh, look, lo and behold, Ronald has a fairly well filled out tree. That looks pretty good. But where does Steve start? Does he just go out and research all of these lines and look at them? Actually, what he needs to do is he needs to compare Ronald's tree with the trees of other people in Ronald's cluster. So he's going to create a cluster based off of Ronald, meaning shared matches for Ronald. Because the real truth is, going back to these matches, Steve's paternal matches are probably there's probably 2 clusters here, one for grandma, one for grandpa. So we need to create a cluster, and you can create a cluster without having a clue who the common ancestor is. We'll create a cluster around Ronald. So Steve is going to take Ronald, and he's going to do shared matches with Ronald. And he pulls up Ronald, Sharon, Tiffany, Randy, Ryan, and Nancy all share DNA with Ronald. So they share DNA with Steve and with Ronald. So he kind of concludes this is another cluster that he can work on. Does that make sense? So this is the cluster we're working on. That's why it's in green. Okay, so we looked at Ronald's tree. Next up, he's going to take the next person on the list. Let's take a look at Sharon's tree. So here's Sharon's tree. And then I'm going to go back and show you Ronald's tree. And are you seeing that common ancestor? There's Sharon's tree. There's Ronald's tree. Do you see a common ancestor? Is there a name or a couple that appears in both trees? And it looks to me like Moses Turner and Agnes Ward are listed in Ronald's tree and in Sharon's tree. So now it's not always this easy to look at 2 trees and you find it. Sometimes you have to build out their trees, but this is what you're looking for. So we discover that Ronald and Sharon both have this couple in their trees. And then Steve is going to continue working through the rest of this cluster that he's created. And he discovers that Tiffany, Ryan, and Nancy or Tiffany and Ryan descend from Moses and Agnes, and Nancy descends from Agnes's parents, Henry and Agnes. So the next thing that Steve is going to do is actually draw out a descendancy showing how all of these people are related to each other. So we kind of get a sense of what all of these relationships are. So there's Moses Turner and Agnes Ward. So we'll notice there's Tiffany, Sharon, Ronald, and Ryan. Notice that asterisk just means they've tested, and I just put the number of shared centimorgans under their name. So it's a way of taking that information off the spreadsheet and putting it in another form. And there's Nancy, she descends just from one generation further back, but they are all tied together. Because they're all tied together, we can make a guess that Steve somehow fits into this tree. Now, we don't know what generation down. I just stuck him at the level of Tiffany, Ryan, and Nancy, but that doesn't mean he's there. He could be in a number of places. But now we're kind of hypothesizing that he fits into this tree. And the reason we're guessing that he's a descendant of Moses and Agnes is because Nancy shares so many fewer centimorgans than the others. However, it could still be that he belongs to a generation back, but this is a starting point. So now that we've identified a common ancestor, Moses and Agnes, you kind of flip it around. We're now going to look for Moses and Agnes's descendants. So Moses Turner married Agnes Ward, and they had only 4 children. The people that we just looked at were all descendants of Hazel, Jesse, or Michael. And Steve isn't sharing, he's sharing about the same amount of DNA with all of them. So we're going to focus on Joseph. However, when you're actually doing this, you probably need to look at all the descendants of all the kids. The real truth is there's only so much space on a slide. So I just focused on Joseph. Joseph had a total of 5 children: Joseph, Evelyn, Marilyn, Jeremy, and George. And at that point, we want to start looking at what point do these children, are they born around the 1940s? Because then we're only going to focus on sons, because Steve is looking for a biological father. He's not looking for a mother as well. So because so Joseph's grandchildren were all born about the 1940s, we're going to just identify the grandsons of Joseph, not the granddaughters, because there's not room for another generation down there. Because even if there was a granddaughter, if she's born in the 40s, she can't have a child who then had a child in the 70s. So you do have to kind of think about some of those things. When can you start having children, and when can you stop having children? And if you're dead or not, you can't be having children. So you have to really kind of get to know these descendants. Anyway, so Joseph had 4 sons. Evelyn didn't have any sons. Marilyn had 1 son. Jeremy had 3 sons, and George has 5 sons. So that's a lot of possible fathers for Steve. Now, one thing that Steve could do is just start reaching out to these families and seeing if they'll take a DNA test and see if he can narrow the things down. But another thing that Steve can do, sorry, going back, so they were born in the 1940s, but the other thing that Steve wants to do is start considering locations, because Moses and Agnes are from Massachusetts. So what he needs to, now if you'll remember, it appears that Kathy was living in California when she got pregnant. So he's thinking, which of these families moved to California? That might help figure out which family to focus on, because locations, it could be that somebody's out traveling or somebody's in the military or something else that brought them out to California. But you want to ask that question, who's in California, so that they could have been there with Kathy when Steve was conceived. Now, the other thing that Steve can do is he can go back and he can create a second cluster. So he'll go back and he'll look at the rest of these people, because Henry's not in that cluster. Joseph, Heather, Jerry, Melissa, Kathy, Richard, Matthew, they belong to maybe the other grandparent. So Steve goes back and he's going to do this exact same process. He's going to look at their trees. He's going to find a common ancestor. And he does find that several of the people in his match list all descend from a Samuel Fuller and a Maggie Dupree. And his question now is, did a descendant of Samuel and Maggie somehow marry into a descendant of the Turner Ward family? And he discovers that Jeremy, who's Joseph's son, actually married Pauline, who's a descendant of Samuel and Maggie. So the fact that he is seeing DNA matches from the Fullers and from the Turners makes him think that his father is a child of Jeremy and Pauline. So most likely what he's done is he's identified his grandparents, that Jeremy and Pauline are his grandparents, and one of their 3 sons are his father. So then he wants to take a closer look at that. From there, he needs to start contacting people. By this point, you have to use late 20th century records, such as obituaries. I call them background finders. I don't know the official terms of these. You could also call them stalker websites like Family Tree Now or Spokeo, or they're websites that claim to do background checks and stuff like that. Will give you a lot of background information on living people. You can use Facebook. I've seen people reach out and connect with family on Facebook. Can look at online trees and look at who's contributing. This is how he's going to find the living relatives, because really what he needs to do now is to find one of Jeremy's children, and it could even be a daughter, it doesn't have to be even a son, and get him to do a DNA test, which will prove whether or not Jeremy is the grandparent that he thinks he is, and then he can figure out which of the kids he actually belongs to. So at this point, if Steve is really interested in pursuing who his father was, he needs to do more additional DNA testing. Because Jeremy, those 3 kids, they don't have any unique ancestors from each other. They all have the same set of ancestors. So, okay. So Steve's goal was to find an unknown parent. He identified matches. He reviewed trees to find the common ancestor. He identified the descendants, and then he looks for connections. Okay. And then the other approach that you can take is, this is more helpful for brick walls, is you might try an approach where you do the research first, set a hypothesis, and then try and prove the hypothesis. And sorry, Lori, I'm not sure exactly what time you wanted me to stop, so I can just speed through this, or I can skip this section. Just let me know what you'd like me to do.
Go ahead and continue.
Okay. Because I know we're coming up on the end of our time and I don't want to go too long. But let me know if I need to go fast. So brick walls, your goal is to prove or disprove a hypothesis. So what you do is you start with the paper trail research, follow the paper trail, hypothesize a relationship, and then identify living descendants of the known ancestor, test their DNA, and then identify the living descendants of the hypothesized ancestor, test their DNA, and then compare the results. So that's kind of the basics of proving a hypothesis. So this is a research first approach to using DNA. And then of course you want to come to a conclusion. So let's take a look at a case. In this case, we're trying to identify the parents of Harriet Dunlap Rose. We want to figure out some basics. What do we know about her? She was born in 1832 in Tennessee, according to the family Bible. She married a man named Stephen Rose in 1853 in Pike County, Tennessee. And I mentioned earlier, these are fictional. The locations are also fictional. Harriet died then in 1877 in Adams County, Tennessee in childbirth. And she and her husband were the parents of 8 children. So if the goal is to find her parents, what are we going to do? Well, we want to start with the paper trail research. So most of this known information comes from the Rose Family Bible. So let's start by taking a quick look at a timeline. We see there that Harriet was born in 1832, died in 1877, that most events seem to have happened in Pike County, Tennessee up till 1860. And then there's a gap of about 6 years before the birth of the next daughter in another location in Adams County, Tennessee. On a side note, make sure you're considering historical events that might have created that gap, also known as the Civil War, probably would also cause them to make the move to a more western county such as Adams County. Anyway, so you go look for more information on Harriet in 1850, when you would think she'd be living with her parents. She's in Pike County, Tennessee, but in a Williamson household, and the Rose family are neighbors. So that's how she met her husband, but it doesn't tell us who her parents are. And there are no other Dunlap households living in Pike County, Tennessee in 1850. And she can't find any connection between the Williamson household and the Rose family. And that's because Pike County burned 3 different times in 1873, 1899, and 1923. So if there were any records, they don't exist any longer. So you go out and you look for other Dunlap families in the surrounding county. And in Harrison County, Tennessee, which is north of Pike County, there is the family of Aaron Dunlap. If you look at dwelling 18, we have Aaron in Louisiana and their children Grace, who are probably children, no relationships listed, Grace, Everett, Jacob, Ida Mae, and Caroline, and living next door is an Aaron and Mary Dunlap. And Aaron is of a good age to have been the oldest son for Aaron, the older Aaron. So you go research the family of Aaron Dunlap. They were living in Harrison in 1860 and 1870 census. In the 1880 census, Louisiana is living with a younger Aaron Dunlap. It appears her husband had died in between 1870 and 1880, and she's listed as mother. So we do prove a relationship there. However, Harrison County is also a burn county. So no records from Pike County, no records from Harrison County. What are we going to do? However, you go back to the 1840 census, you find Aaron Dunlap in Harrison County, and there is a tick mark for an additional daughter that's not listed on the 1850 census, who was born between 1830 and 1835, which is when Harriet would have been born. You also do enough research. Obviously, all this research is taking a lot of time, but you do find there are connections between Aaron's family and Harriet's family. We know that before 1866, Harriet Rose had moved to Adams County. In 1867, Grace Dunlap, who's listed on the 1850 census, married in Adams County and lived there until her death. And in 1880, Caroline, another of the sisters with her husband, had also made their way to Adams County, and they were neighbors of the Rose family. So you do more research and you kind of compare the two. Harriet Dunlap and her family are on the left, and Aaron and his family's on the right. You can kind of see that Harriet's in Pike County, Aaron's in Harrison County. But what's interesting, down at the bottom, you'll see that both families had a daughter named Ida Mae. Is that a kind of evidence of a connection? And then when you try and just slot Harriet into Aaron's family, she fits in nicely with her birth year being right between Aaron Jr. and Grace. Now, with all of that research, with all that evidence, is there enough evidence to conclude that Harriet was the daughter of Aaron? The real truth is no, there's not. That she does look like she could fit into Aaron's family, but that does not mean that she was Aaron's daughter. There's no direct evidence making that connection. However, we can at least hypothesize that there is a connection between Harriet and Aaron. So if our goal was to identify the parents of Harriet, how can we use DNA to help with this goal? Well, our first step was that we did all the traditional paper trail research, and that kind of research sometimes takes a long time to put all that together. But we've come up with a hypothesis that Harriet Rose was the daughter of Aaron and Louisiana Dunlap, who lived in Harrison County, Tennessee in 1850. So our next step is to identify descendants to do DNA testing. So first off, we find descendants of Stephen and Harriet. And you have to find multiple descendants because this is so many generations back. Remember that only a second cousin or closer is guaranteed to share DNA. So in reality, we need multiple descendants of both Stephen and Harriet, and then multiple descendants of Aaron in order to compare the DNA, because it could be that we won't find a relationship otherwise. So here's the descendants of Stephen and Harriet, including there's Katie, by the way, that we were using earlier. And then we also find descendants of Aaron and Louisiana who are willing to do a DNA test. And then you test all of those people. So we would testing the 6 descendants that you found for Stephen and Harriet, and then the 4 descendants that are descendants of Aaron and Louisiana. So once you do all that testing, so I think that's quite a bit of testing, 10 DNA tests, and you probably want to test on the same website or move everything to GEDmatch. You have to start comparing, and there's a lot of different ways I've seen that people are kind of figuring out how to compare the descendants' DNA. But if Harriet is the daughter of Aaron, the first thing that I did, just as I was thinking through the possibilities, is that if Harriet is the daughter of Aaron, how are the descendants of Harriet related to the descendants of Aaron who did the DNA testing? So for example, Jennifer, a descendant of Harriet, would be a fourth cousin to James, who's a descendant of Aaron, a known descendant of Aaron. And then I used that predicted relationship to determine, I used the shared centimorgan chart to guess how much DNA they should share at that relationship. And notice that with every single one of these relationships, the minimum threshold is 0. So just because 2 of these descendants don't share DNA does not mean the relationship doesn't exist. So then I kind of went back and I said, okay, here's what was predicted based on the relationship if Harriet was the daughter of Aaron, and there's the actual amount of DNA shared. You'll notice, like I said, there are situations in which the descendants don't share DNA with each other, but that's okay. So it does look like there is enough evidence, there's enough descendants of Aaron and enough descendants of Harriet who are sharing DNA to conclude that there is a relationship, or there was a relationship between Harriet and Aaron. Whether that's father-daughter is still a little bit more up in the air. And so you'd want to rerun that whole scenario with the idea that maybe Aaron's an uncle, not a father, and then try out some other hypotheses and use that DNA, that descendant. The other thing that you might consider is what's the probability that 2 people share DNA based on a relationship? So there are 24 total pairs of descendants where you take a descendant of Harriet and a descendant of Aaron, and then consider the how likely it is that those 2 people will share DNA. So, and I pulled these numbers out of the ISOG wiki. Third cousins, there's a 97.7% probability they'll share DNA. And out of those cousin relationships that would be third cousins if Harriet is the daughter of Aaron or was the daughter of Aaron, 100% of the third cousins share DNA, 90% of the third cousins once removed, 75%, which kind of matches the probabilities. So again, one thing I'd like to say was, I'm throwing a lot of math ideas, kind of more statistics ideas. A lot of times you won't completely figure out how to make these work until you actually start doing one of these cases. So these are just some ways that you can do this. And I'd also recommend reading, there's a lot of NGSQ articles now that are National Genealogical Society quarterly articles that rely on DNA, and see how they did their analysis of the descendants to figure out the relationships. But based on the shared centimorgans for all of the Aaron Harriet descendants falls within the expected ranges. The percentage of pairs who share DNA matches the probability that pairs will share DNA. Based on that, we can kind of conclude that it's likely that Harriet Dunlap Rose was the daughter of Aaron Dunlap. So you'll see that in this case, when we started with the research first, we're doing the paper trail, hypothesizing the relationship, identifying descendants of both sides of the relationship, the known ancestor as well as the hypothesized ancestor, and then doing DNA testing and comparing the DNA. So this is kind of a different approach than the adoption or the unknown parent or DNA first approach, because you're kind of using the DNA to prove a hypothesis instead. Okay, so we talked some basics. Going back, if all you take away from this class today is that you need to get an online tree up there and start replying to matches, that would be huge. That's a big step forward in getting some use out of your DNA. We talked about cousin matches, finding the most recent common ancestor. We talked a little bit about clustering matches, which is a huge thing. And I know that if you want to really get into clustering matches, just go look on YouTube. There's a lot of good videos out there. And then we kind of just introduced 2 approaches to using DNA in a case study. So the DNA first approach and the research first approach for unknown parents and brick walls. So just a couple last minute things. Just remember, DNA is like other records. So make sure that you're starting with a goal and that you're using your DNA in tandem with paper trail. It cannot replace paper trail. It's part of the toolbox. It's not the whole toolbox. So, and then I always throw, please upload a public tree and respond to messages from other users, just because that is so important that we collaborate, especially as we start using DNA. So questions? And before we jump into questions, down at the bottom, this is just a service that Family Search is offering. We've been offering these since about June, and I just throw it out there that if you have a case and you want to sit down and talk to me about it, you can sign up for a one-on-one consultation. Just pick the DNA research option when you go sign up for a consultation. I do offer DNA consultations. So anyway, do you have any questions? Sorry to kind of go over time a little bit.
Thank you, Beth. You kept that exactly within an hour.
Well, good. I was trying to time it, but I can talk a lot.
We have one question online. Is there a tutorial for connecting your tree and your DNA? I have not done a DNA test yet, but hope to do one on Ancestry real soon. I have two trees, one on Ancestry and one on Family Search.
So I'm guessing that there's a whole help page. Actually, I know there's a help page on Ancestry. That once you get your results, it'll tell you that you just have to go into the settings and say the DNA for this person matches this person in this tree. It's a pretty easy thing to do, but there are helps on Ancestry that will help you with that.
We have one other comment. They compared what you were doing with clusters and matching, finding relatives to using relativefinder.org. And I pointed out to them, yeah, but you're limited to Family Search if you use Relative Finder. I wanted to make a comment for those of you online that are members of UV Tag. We have a group on Relative Finder called UV Tag. You're welcome to come and join. We've noted that in the recent issues of our monthly newsletter. So please check that out and join us there and see if you're related to any of us in the group.
Yeah.
I have one other comment.
But really quickly, I was just going to say that that's actually why I love the View My Relationship feature, because it's kind of like Relative Finder, but you can take any person in the tree and click on that. So if you have somebody's name in a tree that's connected to their DNA and they're deceased, just go find them on Family Tree and click View My Relationship. And it's done all the work for you. It's actually one of my favorite things. I've done, especially on the lines for me that are LDS, that are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Thank you, Beth. We have a couple of thank yous. This was very helpful. Kinds of comments here online too. Anybody in Zoom want to unmute their mic and ask questions?
Beth, I just thought it was a wonderful presentation, and I'm just delighted that we have it recorded so that we can go back over it, because there's so much information in there that we're going to have to see it again to be sure we get it all.
Yeah.
For the rest of you also, you may want to note, like she did here earlier, that this class is available in the help section of both the classes she did today are available in the help section in 10, 15-minute module segments. So you can review that information there also.
Yeah, I recorded it a few years ago, and I need to re-record a more up-to-date version. And they're in the Learning Center on Family Search, which is under help.
We will post a link on our Facebook page and with the rest of you in our Tagology as to where to find this afterwards. We're only going to have it up for a limited time on Facebook. Anybody else? Thank you very much, Beth. Laurie?
Oh, did you want to say something, Beth?
Oh, I just always joke. I said, I don't know if that's because it was a fire hose and you don't know when to stop drinking water long enough to speak, but good luck with your DNA.
Well, I appreciate these presentations, and I have some very clear ideas of what I need to do next to make my DNA efforts more beneficial and effective. So I appreciate that. We do, and thank you so much for being with us. And I hope that you will all consider, you're looking at the screen. I hope you will make an appointment with Beth if you need someone to talk to about this material. It's a wonderful thing that Family Search is offering us the opportunity to have these free online consultations, in as much as we can't go up there at this present time, and this is even more convenient. So the other thing I wanted to mention to everybody is that we have a confirmation of our speaker for next month. His name is Steve Ehat. And if you've been with us for very long, you will recognize that name. He has spoken to us periodically. This time he will give a presentation on newspaper research, and then one on census research. He's going to do both hours. And his presentations are always very good, like the ones you've heard today. So we invite you to join us at that point in time, and to see what you can learn about newspaper and census research that'll be beneficial. And once again, thank you, Beth, and we'll see you all or hear you all next month. Thank you very much.